Hey guys, welcome to a new tutorial from Cauneaus Arts. My name is shounak patwardhan, and in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create cinematic titles in After Effects without any plugins. Here's a preview of what we will be creating. Alright, so let's dive right in. Open up After Effects and let's create a new composition by pressing Ctrl or Command N on the keyboard. 1920 by 1080 at 30 FPS, let's call it Main Composition. Now let's create a new solid by pressing Ctrl or Command Y on the keyboard, press OK. Now let's add some text to this. Let's call it Cinematic Trailer. Reposition this text so that it's in the center of this composition. Now I'm going to add this grunge texture. This is a very generic grunge texture, and you can use pretty much any texture that you have to create a similar effect. Add this grunge texture to the timeline under the text area. Give this an alpha matte. And maybe scale this texture in just a little bit by pressing the shift key so that it scales uniformly. Pre-compose this text layer, call this text composition. Open up the text composition and select the grunge texture, and let's give this a hue saturation effect. And I'm going to desaturate this completely so that it's completely grayscale. Go back to the main composition and I'm going to give this a bevel alpha effect. The edge thickness can be 4 so that this gets a little bit of a 3D effect here. Now let's create a new camera. 35mm is good. And let's create a new null object. I'm going to make this text comp and null both into 3D layers. And I've actually created this null to animate the camera because I don't generally like to animate the camera by itself. The null makes things very easy. So parent the camera to the null. Open up the scale property and let's go to 5 seconds on the timeline and add a keyframe. And then go back to the first frame and add another keyframe and change the scale to 5. So now we have this nice zoom in effect. Select the second keyframe and change it to an easy ease keyframe by pressing the F9 key on the keyboard. And open up the graph editor. And then move this handle as far as it goes to the left. So we have a nice little ease in when it comes to the end of the animation. Now I'm going to bring this grunge texture back into the timeline. Turn this into a 3D layer again. Now the texture kind of animates with the text, and I need a little bit of a depth here. So open up the position property and let's change the position to 2600 so that it's far in the background compared to the text. So this is what it looks like, and we need to scale this up so that it fills the composition area. Let's bring in some hue saturation and desaturate this texture just a touch, and I'm gonna add a brightness contrast to this. Bring down the brightness at 150 and the contrast to 100, and I'm gonna duplicate this brightness contrast by pressing Ctrl D, and for the second one I'm gonna change this contrast to 0 and the brightness to -100. Now I'm gonna bring in this fire embers footage. This is a free footage available on my channel. This is created by me and it's completely free. Drag it to the timeline. Change the mode on this to add. Drag it above the text composition. And let's make this a 3D layer as well. Open up the position property and change this to 2000. And scale this up again so that it fills the composition area. Now with fire there obviously needs to be smoke, so let's create some smoke. Create a new solid, press Ctrl or Command Y, and let's call this smoke. And let's add the fractal noise effect. Okay, change the fractal type to cloudy, change the noise type to spline, bring down the brightness on this. Let's change the contrast a little bit. Open up the transform properties, and for the scale I'm going to change this to 1500. And for the complexity, I'm going to change this to 9. Okay, so now we need to animate this smoke. Since the fire embers footage is moving from the left to the right, the smoke will also need to move from the left to the right. First, let's change this to add. For the turbulence, now I'm going to go to the 5-second mark again, and I'm going to keyframe the offset turbulence and the evolution. Okay, and then go back to the first frame and open up the animated properties by pressing U on the keyboard. And I'm going to keyframe both of them here and go back to the 5-second mark, and I'm going to change the offset turbulence and move it to the right. And since smoke will also rise up, so I'm going to change the Y value so that it travels upwards. And I'm gonna change the evolution just a touch so that it's not like stagnant. Okay, so I'm going to add a tritone effect to this because I want the smoke to be slightly bluish. I'm going to change this to like a dark blue color here. And that is what it looks like with smoke. Now let's add some animation to the starting of this composition. Okay, so let's add some flares. Control Y to create a new solid, and let's call this flare. Press OK. And I'm going to add the After Effects default lens flare that comes with After Effects. This is not optical flares. This is not a third-party plugin. I'm going to change the mode to add. I'm going to position it outside so we don't actually get the main flare. We just get some of these artifacts that come with the flare. And I'm going to change this to 35mm prime. And the brightness will be 96%. And also this will be a 3D layer. I'm going to position it just above the smoke. Duplicate this flare. Select the lens flare and position it at the top of this composition. Somewhere around here. And I'm going to animate this flare. So go to the 2-second mark. And let's animate the flare brightness here. I'm going to change this to 165. And maybe position the flare slightly away from the composition. At the beginning of this composition, I'm going to change this to 280 so that it's almost completely white here, and we get this nice wipe in from the light. And I'm going to show the keyframes and change these to Easy Ease keyframes as well. Now let's add an adjustment layer to this. So go to Layer and New Adjustment Layer. And let's call this FX, and I'm going to add a Gaussian blur to this. Go to the 2-second mark again, keyframe the blurriness and keep it at 0, and go back to the beginning of the timeline and change the blurriness to 85. Okay, so we also have this blur when the animation plays in. And I'm going to select the second keyframe and change this to an Easy Ease keyframe by pressing F9 on the keyboard. Now let's also add some color correction to this. Let's drag in the adjustment layer and change it to an actual adjustment layer. And let's add in the levels effect. And I'm just going to change this so that it looks a little bit more contrasty. Alright, so that is what this looks like. Now let's add some flares on the text as well. So let's bring in the flare. And by default, change this to an add mode. And let's add a lens flare effect. And for this, I'm going to position the flare dead into the center of this composition. Change the brightness to 90%. Scale this flare down quite a bit. Okay. Almost to the extent that it's just a line. And I'm going to place it just above the text. Okay. At the edge of the text. Duplicate this flare and place the other one at the bottom of this text. Let's go to the 5-second mark again. Select both of these other flares and press P on your keyboard to open up the position property, and let's keyframe it. Go back to the first frame. Now obviously we can't see it properly, so let's go to like the second and keyframe the position property here and go back to the end, animate the position so that it's kind of moving towards the center. Both the flares move towards the center of this composition. Now, just to give this a little bit more depth, I'm going to duplicate this grunge texture and bring it at the top of everything except the adjustment layers, and change the blend mode on this to add, remove the brightness contrast effects, desaturate this completely, and change the opacity to 3%. Desaturate this layer completely, change the position on this to -300, and scale this down so that it just touches the edges of this composition. Change the opacity to 4%. And I'm going to rotate this layer 180 degrees. And that's the end of the tutorial. We have created a cinematic trailer without any plugins in After Effects. Alright guys, that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and if you found the video interesting, hit the like button and consider subscribing to Cauneaus Arts.